It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Tim Shahan, who will give the first of the tutorials, the SQAB tutorials today. Tim got his PhD at West Virginia University in 1998, and after brief stints at the University of Vermont and the University of New Hampshire, he moved to Utah State University, the Department of Psychology there, where he is now an associate professor and a director of the Experimental and Applied Psychological Science Division of the graduate program there. Tim's research interests are fairly broad, with, as most of you well know, with an emphasis on behavioral momentum, a phenomenon to which he has contributed important data and important theoretical developments. Somewhat more relevant, I think, to today's tutorial is his interest in attention, and especially in the behavioral processes involved in what we call attention. So today he's going to tutor us in the set of phenomena that give rise to the concept of conditioned reinforcement, actually a concept that I've had interest in for a very long time, so I'm interested in what Tim has to say about this as well. So without further ado, here's Dr. Tim Shahan.
Thanks, Mark. It's interesting. I see everything that I'm going to say today as being related to attention, but I'm actually not going to talk about any attention data directly, so it's kind of interesting. Okay, so here's a brief overview of, let me know if you can't hear me in the back or move up. A brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to provide an overview of the concept of conditioned reinforcement and how it's been typically studied. Review its role in quantitative choice theories. This is a SQAB tutorial. And then discuss a little bit some persistent questions about how putative conditioned reinforcers have their effects on behavior. I'm going to start with a series of quotes. I think this is a very poetic one from Honig about conditioned reinforcement. It's for many years been recognized as an introductory text as an important phenomenon, since it may provide the connective tissue between the dry bones of the experimental psychology of learning and the living flesh of the behavior of real people. So we all know this concept has served a critical role in applications of learning theory to understanding real human behavior. It's actually the crux, right? Everything, usually the things that we study with non-humans are primary reinforcers, and we extrapolate to humans in their natural environments, and we invoke the notion of conditioned reinforcement all the time in doing that. It's a critical concept for those sorts of extensions. Or maybe it's not, but we do it anyway. This is a quote from Ben Williams, who in this paper, which is a great paper, if you want a real tutorial on conditioned reinforcement, go to this paper by Ben Williams. And he was lamenting the fact that the concept has sort of fallen out of recent textbooks on learning. In fact, it's pretty much disappeared. You get a couple of sentences, maybe a page if you're lucky, usually not. And he says, to judge by the treatment of conditioned reinforcement in recent textbooks and learning, the perception of its importance has receded substantially. Now, the reason for that, perhaps, is some of the things I'll talk about later in the talk about what is actually going on with conditioned reinforcement. Okay, so what is a conditioned reinforcer? I'm going to, I've gone through some textbooks of myself here to see what you can, I could write a definition, but it was interesting to see what other people had to say. Mazur's textbook says it's a previously neutral stimulus that's acquired the capacity to strengthen responses. That resonates well with me. He didn't say anything about increasing response rates. He said strengthen responses is pretty general because it's been repeatedly paired with a primary reinforcer. That we could probably do better with than repeatedly paired, but it's an undergraduate textbook, and he didn't want to confuse them yet. So, this is actually not a textbook. This is back to Ben Williams's paper, and he says it's an initially neutral event that acquires value because of its relation to primary reinforcement. And this is the thing that I think can be fairly controversial in interpreting how conditioned reinforcers have their effects. Is do they acquire the value of the primary reinforcer? And finally, from Mark Boughton's textbook, more recently, and this is perhaps the most agnostic of them, I think, the stimulus that's acquired the capacity to reinforce behavior, whatever that is, reinforce behavior, through its association with a primary reinforcer. So you don't have to be specific about how this happens exactly. We can go to associated and leave it at that for now. Okay. Now, generally, this is considered a Pavlovian process. So if we have a US here, an unconditioned stimulus that produces an unconditioned response, and some other stimulus, let's say, is associated with it to remain neutral here. Presumably, the CS acquires some of the value of this US produces a conditioned response, sometimes like the unconditioned response, sometimes not, but straight up Pavlovian conditioning, just like in Pavlov's lab. Now, when we get to conditioned reinforcement, the idea is basically the same, except we have this stimulus that can function as a reinforcer for operant behavior, but then there's some stimulus that is associated with it that also acquires that capacity to reinforce. Now, you can do this before you introduce the operant response, and lots of ways to study conditioned reinforcement do that, or you can do it at the same time and find out if this has acquired the capacity, presumably through the same sort of processes that happen up here, down here, for this to now function as a reinforcer for operant behavior. I'm going to go through these quickly. So there's some standard procedures for doing this. Resistance to extinction tests. A response produces a primary reinforcer that's paired with a stimulus, and then you examine the persistence of that response during extinction and see how long it goes on. Now, if you're going to do this the right way, there are a ton of controls that nobody ever runs that would let you see that this has become a conditioned reinforcer. But that's one way to do it. The new response procedure, you could, before you start any operant training whatsoever, you should take a stimulus, you pair it just like in my previous slide, and then you take that stimulus and you present it response dependently on on some response, and you see if you can increase the frequency of that response, and then you say, yeah, it's a reinforcer. It's increased the rate or the probability of that behavior. Now, both of these have largely been abandoned unless you study drug abuse. They have not been abandoned, and they also still don't run the right control procedures. But really, one of the problems is the effects are short-lived, and there are all sorts of interpretive difficulties. Maybe once, Ben points out, have the appropriate controls been run here, and it seems like things work out as they should, but almost never are they run. Now, the history of this group is where schedules of reinforcement come in, and people will look for ways to study conditioned reinforcement and where it could be maintained for a longer period. So one way to do this is second-order brief schedules. This gets complicated, but the completion of some schedule itself produces a stimulus. You use that as a unit in another schedule. So you might have an FI20 that produces a stimulus that's ultimately presented just before food comes as well, and you reinforce that as a unit. So you might do 10 of those before the reinforcer is presented. So you have an FI20 as stimulus, you do that once, an FI20 as stimulus, you do that twice, 10 times, and then the food comes at the end. And you can get higher rates with the stimulus than without it. You can get some patterning and nice stuff like that makes you think it's a reinforcer, but then there are these data out there showing that you can also get higher rates when the stimulus isn't paired with the primary reinforcer. There's some interesting effects there that can be a little strange and challenging to a traditional notion of conditioned reinforcement. Now, chain schedules. We have 2 or more schedules of reinforcement. They're presented sequentially. You complete one, you get to the next one. There's a stimulus change. You complete this one, you get to the next one. There's a stimulus change, and then a reinforcer. The classical interpretation of these is that this stimulus change functions as a reinforcer for a behavior that's occurring here. And when you get there, it's an SD for engaging in that behavior, which is reinforced by this stimulus change. This is an SD for behaving here, and you get to the reinforcer. It can show schedule patterning, those sorts of things that make you think that these are reinforcers. Now, meanwhile, this is how we're going to get to the choice theories. The matching law. So in 1961, Herrnstein presented pigeons with 2 keys, and he varied the relative frequency of reward, the relative rate of reinforcement produced by these 2 keys, and found that the percentage or proportion of behavior to those 2 options matched the relative rate of reinforcement on the 2 options. So if you've got 9 times as many reinforcers here as you do here, you get approximately 9 times as much behavior here as you do here. Here's his famous figure from that paper showing that you get matching here. Okay. And that gets us to concurrent chains, which have been used widely to study conditioned reinforcement in terms of choice theories. And so here, we're using concurrent schedules here in the initial links. So we have a VI 120 on both of these, but rather than producing food directly, they're producing transitions to terminal links, mutually exclusive terminal links. So if the schedule requirement times out here, you move to this terminal link, you get this green key, which is associated with some schedule of food delivery. Ditto over here, and you say we have a higher rate of food delivery over here. Now the idea is that you can measure preference for these stimuli and their condition reinforcing values. So you can change things here in the terminal links, and then the relative allocation of behavior up here gives you a measure of the relative value of these terminal links, presumably the terminal link stimuli as conditioned reinforcers. Now, this is just to show you that I'm going to show you a lot of these for a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to drop all of this fancy business over here and just drop them all together so you can see that all the links at the same time, but they're still mutually exclusive. Just how I'm going to show them to you. Okay, Herrnstein 64 and Aitor 60, I suppose, as well, found that the relative rate of initial link responding, or choice here in the initial links, matches the relative rate of terminal link primary reinforcement. So if you vary the relative rates of reinforcement provided in these terminal links, he got matching. It's this heavy line here that you see up here. You get matching there as well. And so the idea so Herrnstein's conclusion here is the strength of a secondary reinforcer is influenced by the frequency of primary reinforcement in its presence. So you can vary those rates of primary reinforcement. See, the behavior vary, and the matching law does a good job of describing those variations. But Fantino 69 showed that it's a little more complicated than that. What he showed was that initial link preference here depends on the relative length of these initial links to the terminal links. As they get longer, here's what he actually found. Matching, by the way, the Herrnstein sort of finding there predicts 0.75 for all of these cases because the relative rate of reinforcement in these two is staying the same. But as you stretch out those initial links, what you see is a decrease in preference for the richer alternative. So you get this drift toward indifference as you increase the initial links relative to the terminal links. So it's not just matching there. Something else is happening. So Fantino proposed what was then delay reduction hypothesis, now called delay reduction theory. And what it says is that the condition reinforcing value of a stimulus depends upon the reduction in delay to primary reinforcement that it signals. And choice in these preparations matches relative delay reduction. So we have delay reduction over here for one of the options. T is just the average overall time to reinforcement or delay to reinforcement from the onset of those initial links. These little t's are the average delay to reinforcement from the onset of the terminal links. And the value here is just you subtract out the value of that terminal link from the overall time. How much of a reduction in the time to reinforcement is that stimulus associated with? And this is just simply the matching law here for the two separate links, right? So we just substituted reinforcement for relative delay reduction, right? We substituted relative delay reduction for just standard primary reinforcement. And just to show you what this looks like, T, I won't go through the prediction, the calculations, we'll run out of time too quickly. What you can see is that as you increase the initial links, T is increasing pretty dramatically here, and the theory is predicting, 1.0 preference here, 0.75, 0.55. Remember that pretty closely corresponds to what happened in the Fantino experiment. Now, Squires and Fantino, they just simply added a term here for rate of primary reinforcement, because if you vary those initial links, what you're also changing is the rate of overall primary reinforcement. So if you have different length initial links, one of them might provide a higher rate of primary reinforcement than the other one, and that needs to get in here. Plus, it has the nice property that it reduces to just the standard matching law when the terminal links are zero, in essence. And so we've got a more general theory here that reduces to strict matching. Okay. Now, to move to newer accounts of concurrent schedule performance, we're going to have to talk about the generalized matching law for a couple minutes. So basically, this is just a modification of the matching law. We're using behavior ratios now rather than proportions. We've added parameters for sensitivity to relative reinforcement rate and bias for one option or the other unrelated to reinforcement. So this accounts for commonly obtained deviations from strict matching. Now, we also need to talk about concatenated generalized matching a little bit. And this says that choice is a function of the relative value of the reinforcers provided by the option. So I've just replaced rate with value here. And value is multiply determined. It might be determined by the rate of the reinforcer, the magnitudes of them, the delay to the reinforcers, all sorts of things you can put in there, which I have in fact done down here for you. So we've just added, so here's reinforcement rate. amount. This is delay. Each of them gets a sensitivity parameter. We still have bias here. And so now we're saying the value of them is determined by these other characteristics of the reinforcers. And this is what's going to help us get back to concurrent chains. So what about generalized matching and concurrent chains? To extend generalized matching to concurrent chains, in essence, what you say is that choice is a function of the relative rate of transition to each of the terminal link stimuli. You can think of this as the rate of condition reinforcement, right? How often are you producing those transitions? And what's the value of those stimuli once you get there, right? What's the value of the stimulus, the relative value, and how often do you transition to them? And so the other models that I'll talk about briefly here share this characteristic that in essence they have this piece, and then they basically just differ on what you're supposed to put over here. Sorry, but what do you put over there? So one option, which is the contextual choice model, says that, all right, condition reinforcement, the value of the terminal links as condition reinforcers is actually independent of the context, despite what you saw in the Fantino data. The value is not dependent upon the context, but how sensitive organisms are to differences in value does depend on the context. So when you get longer initial links relative to terminal links, that whole delay reduction business, it's not changing value. What it's changing is how sensitive you are to the value that's there. And the value, I've just put delay here, which is the simplest version. Just the immediacy of the reinforcers provided in the terminal links. You can also put amount in there or whatever else you need to for the terminal link stimuli. But notice what's happening to the sensitivity parameter here. It's being raised to this TT over TI. So this is the average terminal link duration and the average initial link duration. When you get longer initial links relative to terminal links, that value gets smaller. That sensitivity is being multiplied by a smaller number. Sensitivity goes down. But value depends upon just immediacy, amount, those sorts of things. So these are theories of condition reinforcement, really, right? If you look at these terminal link stimuli, this is what these are. They're telling you about what determines condition reinforcing value. Another version of a concatenated generalized matching version of this is Mazur's hyperbolic value added model. And it says that really you calculate value via the hyperbolic decay model, which is a straight up theory of condition reinforcement. And it says you calculate value that way. Now, how do you move this into concurrent chains? It gets a little complicated. But in essence, what it says is that choice is governed by the relative increase in value produced by the transition to a terminal link. And here's the hyperbolic decay model. It just says, the amount of the primary reinforcer and delay to it, and the discounting of delay, how sensitive they are to delay. Don't worry about sigma here right now. It doesn't matter for our present purposes. But in essence, you just use that V to calculate these different values. So what's the value of the terminal link here? What's the value of the initial link? Any value that's left over is the value of that transition. Okay. Now, when these models are equipped with equal numbers of parameters, which they're not up here, but they all do pretty darn well with the data. There are other ways to discriminate them and to think that maybe they're all wrong, but we don't need to talk about that right now. Now, DRT does differ from these other two because it doesn't include a role for the rates of condition reinforcement on choice, which is a little odd. It says these things are reinforcers, but if you vary their rate, it doesn't have any impact on behavior. Think about that for a couple of minutes. Edmund's not here to defend himself, but I won't say too much. But it's a slightly odd thing to say. Now, not that this is especially profound, but we'll talk about it a little bit. We showed that choice does in fact match relative rates of condition reinforcement, which means that you need to be able to account for variations in relative condition reinforcement as well. So we used a concurrent observing procedure, not a concurrent chains procedure. Honestly, in my opinion, we've depended way too heavily on concurrent chains, if for no other reason that it really restricts our generality when thinking about condition reinforcement in these choice models. And I'll talk a little bit about observing here, because it's another way to study condition reinforcement, a very common and well-established way to do this. So Over here on a food key, we've got a schedule of primary reinforcement, say a random minimal or VI 15 schedule alternating with extinction. It's a mixed schedule. There's no stimuli differentiating these two things. But if you make a response over here on an observing key, right now it's on an FR1, you produce a stimulus transition. You produce a transition. If the RI15 is in effect, you get an S plus. If the extinction is in effect, you get an S minus. And lots of people who use this procedure and others believe that this S plus is a condition reinforcer. So after 15 seconds, it cycles back here to get the stimuli. You respond again. This is one of the ties to attention. You consider this attending to the stimuli to be discriminated here, which is why Wyckoff developed this procedure to begin with. Now here's what we did. It was a concurrent observing procedure, and I think there's a lot more mileage to be had out of this for evaluating choice theories. So we have the VI 90 and alternating with extinction unsignaled here. We've dropped the S minus presentations. Turns out you don't need them at all. It's just a complication. And we have two observing keys, and they're producing transitions to the VI 90 stimulus when the VI 90 is on different VI schedules. So you've got different ratios of rates of conditioned reinforcement transition. So we've got a VI 100 versus a VI 11, so we've got a 9-to-1 ratio of rate of conditioned reinforcement on one key versus 1 to 9. And so we vary those. And we saw that this is just the matching law. I put little r's on there to say this is rate of conditioned reinforcement. Using that procedure, there are absolutely no changes in rates of primary reinforcement. I can show you that if you want. But you get matching to rates of conditioned reinforcement. Now, yay, yeah, okay. Condition reinforcement and response strength. Great. They're reinforcers. They follow the matching law. You vary the rates, even though DRT says that shouldn't happen, and it doesn't in concurrent chains very well. So we're very happy about this because, choice is considered a measure of relative response strength. They're reinforcers. They strengthen behavior, right? All is right with the world. And here's Mazur's quote again. They strengthen responses, all is well. But, I don't know if you can see that. I can't really. It says, things are less clear with another measure of response strength, resistance to change. So behavioral momentum theory suggests that response rate is not a terribly good measure of response strength. And then, in fact, what you want to do is to train the behavior and then perturb it somehow, disrupt it, and see how persistent it is in the face of that disruption. And this is, in fact, a better measure of response strength. So it says that, response rates are governed by this contingent relation between responses and reinforcers. Resistance to change or resistance to disruption is actually governed by this Pavlovian relationship between an SD context and all the reinforcers delivered in its presence. Okay, and resistance to change provides our measure of response strength. Whoa. I didn't know I could do that. That's nice. Now, how do you typically study resistance to change? We typically use multiple schedules, and they arrange different rates or magnitudes of primary reinforcers. So here's a multiple schedule. We've got green and a little blackout, and then a red period and a little blackout. And they alternate back and forth. These white lines are reinforcers. So you see we've got a much higher rate of reinforcement during green than during red. We establish a baseline here, and we disrupt it, for example, through extinction, which is what this is, or something like pre-feeding. And you look at the behavior as a proportion of baseline. This is on a log scale here, and you see that the rich persists longer than the lean. And so you can use the slopes of those as a measure of response strength. The relative slope there will tell you the relative response strength or relative resistance to change of the two of responding in the two contexts. Now, behavioral momentum theory says that resistance to change is greater in the presence of stimuli associated with higher rates of reinforcement than lower rates of reinforcement. M here is resistance to change measured as the inverse of that slope or log proportion to baseline. Not terribly important for our present purposes. And this is just from Nevin 92 showing all the studies that he had done where he'd varied reinforcement rates, or amounts actually, on here. And it's a power function of the relative rate of reinforcement here. And this turns out in the long run to be equal to about 0.5 most of the time. So our question was this. All right, the reinforcers have got conditioned reinforcers. They should increase response strength as measured this way as well. So does relative resistance to change depend on relative rate of conditioned reinforcement? And there are a bunch of studies that we've done on this, a number of them. And so we're back to observing here. And so we have this observing response procedure, and we have a rich component. We have an RI 120 versus extinction here, and now we're transitioning to these stimuli on an RI 15, producing NUS plus. And another that's just to show you that. And a lean component everything is exactly the same, except we're using different stimuli here, and we're transitioning to S plus less frequently. So you can vary. So this is the rich component, high rate of condition reinforcement, lower rate of condition reinforcement. So in a session, you have 5-minute periods of where they're responding and producing condition reinforcement at a high rate or at a low rate. So it's just the standard multiple schedule. But nested inside of it is this way for us to study condition reinforcement, which has the benefit of not varying rates of primary reinforcement. Right? That's what this procedure lets you do. So we can vary rate of condition reinforcement, but we don't screw up rates of primary reinforcement. And the good news is, it's just like the concurrent schedule data, our observing rates are higher with the higher rate of S plus delivery, condition reinforcement, and okay, great, it's a condition reinforcer. Unfortunately, if you look at resistance to change, it was totally unaffected by the rate of S plus delivery. If anything, with really high rates, it went in the opposite direction. Now, the problem is there were some small changes in primary reinforcement, because even this procedure, if you take it out too far, you start to muck with rates of primary reinforcement. So, all right, S plus deliveries and their rate don't contribute to response strength as measured this way. So I said, okay, what about the value of the condition reinforcers? Let's present them at the same rates and then vary their value. Now, this gets really kind of complicated, so I'm not going to go into it. But in 3 experiments, we've varied value in 3 different ways. The best one is to decrease how frequently you produce an S plus. And you can do this without changing the rates of condition reinforcement too badly. But you should increase their relative value based on any sort of thinking about condition reinforcement, so that it's just like delay reduction. As you increase the time between those S plus presentations, their value should go up. And so we did this in 3 different ways. All of them produce higher rates of observing with higher valued S pluses. And so, yeah, we've got S plus as a condition reinforcer. And resistance to change was totally unaffected by value again. So we've got value not impacting resistance to change either. This is just the summary to show you how bad this is. This is a resistance to change analysis of various things that are varied here. S plus value across our experiments. That's nice, huh? As the value of the condition reinforcer is greater, response strength as measured by resistance to change goes down in that component. Now, the problem is that across experiments, the rate of food delivery is also going up in them. But there are conditions where those things are pretty well controlled, and we still don't see anything. S plus presentation rate, also a mess. The only thing that impacted resistance to change in any of these experiments was primary reinforcement. Despite the fact that observing rates are going exactly where they should go as you change important things about condition reinforcers, like their rate, like their value, right? Have no impact on resistance. But you're sensitive to changes in primary reinforcement here. All right, so this is just a summary of that. S plus is generally considered a condition reinforcer. Higher rates of them produce increases in rates of behavior. Increases in their value increase rates of behavior. Get no effects on response strength. Right? Remember Mazur's definition here. So are they really reinforcers? Well, it depends, I guess. Do you accept resistance to change as a measure of response strength and a way to measure how reinforcers impact behavior? We know rates isn't a great way to do this. So if we're not going to use rates, we could use choice, but things will get ugly there in a second too. Are they really reinforcers? Do they really have value? And of course, people have been talking about this since well before I was born. This is all reminiscent of a controversy that starts, doesn't start, but it became really obvious here with Schuster 69. So here's this procedure. It's basically a concurrent chains procedure. Leave it at that. We got initial links here, both producing transitions on a VI60. And one of them, there's this stimulus paired with food here at the end on a VI30. In the other one, the stimulus is also there, but along the way, on an FR11, you respond and it produces that stimulus, right? Now, this is paired with food and presumably could become a conditioned reinforcer, and you're responding more and you're producing more of them along the way. And, whoops. The good news is that when you in here, response rates are higher. Okay, it's a conditioned reinforcer, right? It's responding, they're producing behavior. Problem is, if anything, and not really if anything, there really was a preference for this one. So even though when you get there, you respond a lot and produce them and it looks like a condition reinforcer, they're going for the other option. I also did another experiment that nobody really talks about, which is he tried to find contrast in a multiple schedule. So basically, you just skip this part and present these two. If you add real reinforcers, primary reinforcers over here, you get a decrease in response rates over here, right? If you add condition reinforcers, they respond and produce more of them, but you don't see any contrast. You'd also expect them to produce contrast if they are reinforcers. And they don't do that. Okay, so they should add value, and so Schuster suggested a frustration or informational sort of account. There are lots of ways you can do this. I personally, I'm calling this the SD signals feedback signpost means to an end account. Pick one, except for this one. I don't think that will actually be appropriate in the long run, but I'm partial to signposts and means to an end, which those have been around with us for a very long time, since Wolf and his classic studies on token reinforcement. And when you start tokens, another way to study condition reinforcement. Take a physical object, right, and you make it exchangeable for primary reinforcers. Organisms work for those and exchange them. We have token economies in the applied world and the whole bit. Typically, those things are considered to function as condition reinforcers, and we have money, or these days, points that we add and subtract with pieces of plastic. So tokens. Now, the idea here is that, from all of these approaches, is that condition reinforcement is a misnomer. That, in fact, this is actually not a reinforcement process. Now, obviously, people have been saying this for a very long time. And it's that these stimuli are actually guiding behavior, not strengthening it. Now, they say that in different ways across these folks, but basically that's the idea is that behavior is being guided by stimuli. So think of it as a signpost, right? You're driving down the road. Are they conditioned reinforcers? Right? You're getting closer. You don't stop and put them in the back of your car and take them home with you because they're so great, right? You follow them. And if things change and they take you in the wrong direction, you follow them for a while before you bump into that, right? So you can think of resistance to extinction in classical ways of studying this, right? Another way I like to think about this is sort of like landing lights at an airport, right? They're sort of guiding the behavior to the reinforcer. And after a while, when you change things to study conditioned reinforcement, it takes a while to bump into the fact that they're guiding you in the wrong direction. So you might say they've strengthened the behavior, right? You might even work to produce them. But are they reinforcers in the sense that they're strengthening behavior? Maybe not. Now, the first thing that I thought, I'm classically trained at West Virginia University about conditioned reinforcement. I was a true believer in the concept of conditioned reinforcement as strengthening. And the first thing I thought, informational account like that just can't work. We know that it's not information. And so the going sort of hypothesis at a time in approaching this from an informational perspective was uncertainty reduction. And this is absolutely not the same thing. It's much better formulated than what I just said to you, which makes it easy to test. Basically, you assert that stimuli providing a reduction in uncertainty are reinforcing. So in that observing procedure, you produce an S+, there's a reduction in uncertainty. The component that you're in is being signaled, or you get an S-. What this hypothesis suggests is that the S- should be reinforcing too. It should be a conditioned reinforcer because it produces exactly the same amount of reduction in uncertainty, 1 bit. And we know full well that in the standard experiments to study this with observing, that produce of negative information, or S-, is not reinforcing. If that's all they get, they stop. In fact, you can show that you can punish behavior by producing those things. I thought those things were very compelling for a very long time. But I'm coming to believe that it kind of misses the point. The fact that S- alone is not reinforcing... Think of the procedures that you're studying here. You've got an observing procedure. The stimuli are alternating back and forth. All you get is S-. What do you do now? Nothing, right? So you're going down the road. The sign says, you know what? You're going the wrong direction. But you can't turn around, right? And so do you keep looking at the signs and say, hey, you're going the wrong direction. You're going the wrong direction. There's absolutely no ecological validity here unless you can leave, right? If you get S-, go to a different tree, right? If you get to a tree, there's no fruit on the ground, you leave. You go to another one. Now, Lieberman and Wilton, I think, actually suggested this in the early 70s as well, is basically you have to look at the utility of the information. And this resonates with me. Does it allow effective action? Right? We think about contingencies of reinforcement, operant behavior. Do these stimuli allow effective action? And up here, of course, they don't really, unless there is a big savings in effort, which has happened in the human literature. If you get big savings in effort, you can in fact see that S- is a conditioned reinforcer. Or if you let the animal, this has not been done terribly well as of yet, if you let the animal change their situation when they get S-, there's a study by Alan Littell that's related. It's not perfect for this sort of interpretation. But if you let them better their situation, you can show that they will observe under those circumstances. If you get S- and you can leave and go somewhere else, then it can. So Davison and Baum, to bring this issue up recently, this is in essence an extension of a study by Bowles in 1961. But their procedure, this is much more extensive, and I think you can interpret it more clearly. They're using frequently changing concurrent schedules of reinforcement. Come to Billy Baum's talk later, and I'm sure you'll get to see a lot of how this happens. So we got concurrent schedules on VIs, and they're rapidly changing across the session. So you're exposed to, rich here, lean here for a while, and then it would reverse, it'll be equal. And so the reinforcer allocation is changing within the session across blocks of time. Now, previous work that they've done with primary reinforcers, so that when animals get a primary reinforcer, you get this pulse of preference to where it came from. That, preference goes up for it a little while, they allocate more behavior, and then it goes down over time. So preference pulse. Now, what they found is in this procedure, they had stimuli that were either correlated or uncorrelated with reinforcement, or paired or unpaired with reinforcement as well, and that these stimuli that they were producing on the options were also producing preference pulses. And you can say, they're conditioned reinforcers. The problem what they found was that their pairing, they could vary the pairing with food, and it didn't matter for squat. It's kind of like we're back to second order schedules again here, right? The pairing didn't matter. What did matter is what the stimulus predicted about an option. If the stimulus that they were earning predicted that there were going to be more reinforcers on that side, so if the correlation between signals and food...
You need to stand in front of the microphone.
Okay. Okay.
That only records, that doesn't sound out here.
Okay, thank you. So if the stimulus predicted more food in an option, then it produced a preference pulse. If it predicted more food on the other option, that is, it was negatively correlated with food, they'd get a stimulus on a side, they would go to the other option, right? So the preference pulse is on the other one. So you have to say if it's a conditioned reinforcer, it reinforced the other behavior, right? Okay, so that's just saying that again. And what Davison and Baum suggested is that all conditioned reinforcement is really just signaling. Here we go again, right? This is why they were down there again. That these are just signals. They're just tracking signals because they guide them to reinforcers, in essence. Now, that's a signal sort of interpretation. I want to talk to you about means to an end a little bit. This is what started me down this path of skepticism. But nobody has ever seen these data probably. They're in behavioral pharmacology. And these are rats who are observing for alcohol-associated stimuli. So these are rats, and they're drinking, they're self-administering alcohol. That's the reinforcer, little dipper cups of alcohol. And sometimes they can produce alcohol, and sometimes they can't. Those periods are unsignaled, except pressing another lever produces stimuli correlated with those periods. And here was the question here. The good thing about alcohol is that, unlike food when we use it, you easily start to skirt the limits of satiation with alcohol and other drug reinforcers, which makes things kind of interesting and makes you start to think about economics a little bit. What we did across conditions, this is FR1 observing. So what I'm going to show you here are stimuli per session, or dippers per session. We did this with different FRs. This basic result is the same in all of them. But so you can just think of these dippers per session as observing responses, because you only count the one that produces it. We varied the alcohol concentration across conditions here up to 20%. And here's what happens to how much alcohol they drink, grams per kilogram of F. What would you expect a conditioned reinforcer to do? And honestly, we didn't know the answer to this question. Would you expect it to track how much of the actual reinforcer you're getting, the grams per kilogram of ethanol here, or the number of drinks you need to get there? This made me think of them as a means to an end, right? You can think of this as they're using the stimuli, and notice it's tracking this one and not this one. If you need more drinks, you gotta find more of them, right? And so that's what we're tracking here. And these, to me, start to feel like tokens, right? They're exchangeable. They're a means to an end. They're a means to an end, right? They allow effective action. They're part of this behavior that's producing what's going on here. They may not have any function other than that. Can you assert that from this? No. So think tokens and behavioral economics. You start to think about the economics of S pluses, which outside of token reinforcement, we've completely, the notion of a medium of exchange and conditioned reinforcement is sort of disappears from behavioral economics, right? I mean, it's not well worked into that sort of situation. Now, some reasons to suspend judgment and to maintain the faith. First of all, there are no data, as far as I know, that make it impossible to believe that stimuli associated with primary reinforcers strengthen behavior. I don't think there's anything that makes it impossible. So that's nice. Some of the data, like the Schuster data, Ben Williams pointed this out a while ago, that there's possibly a problem with second-order conditioning here in the Schuster experiment, and the same problem is going to, I'll show you this in Schuster. So the value from these added stimuli in the terminal links has to get up to the terminal link before it can impact preference for that terminal link. And so you got to have conditioning to the stimuli that are there and then up to that context to measure a preference for them. And it's just not clear if you'd expect second-order conditioning to happen there or not. Exactly the same thing is true. Oh, that's not true in our concurrent observing study, but that's just a change in rate, right? But it doesn't require any sort of second-order conditioning like that. And our resistance to change work, remember, resistance to change is governed by that stimulus reinforcer relation. So it's like we're adding reinforcers to the context, but now there's stimuli that are presumably conditioned reinforcers. You got to have second-order conditioning to get up to the context for it to impact resistance to change. And so that could be why we're not seeing it here. Okay, so those are reasons to suspend judgment. The other one is that Michael might disagree. Davison and Baum show that signaling can happen, but there's nothing in those data that says that that's all that can happen. The fact that they can signal, the fact that the stimulus could function as a signal or a discriminative stimuli for going somewhere else is not, it doesn't mean that it also can't strengthen behavior. You can override one with the other, possibly, but it's not evidence that that's all that can happen. Boutros and al. Using a different stimuli. Most importantly, they didn't use stimuli correlated with the hopper presentation with pigeons, and a steady state procedure. They found that pairing, now this is just the opposite we're finding, right? Michael disagrees, he can tell me about it. But pairing was critical and correlation had no effect. So just the opposite of what I said to you previously. It didn't matter if the stimulus predicted more food on the other side. There was still a little preference pulse on the side that produced it. So, now, based on those reasons to suspend judgment, am I willing to suspend judgment? Yeah, but I also think there's an even bigger issue here to think about. Do we even need strengthening at all? And this Davison and Baum also address. They not only do they conclude that conditioned reinforcers don't strengthen behavior, but they conclude that reinforcers don't strengthen behavior. That in fact, primary reinforcers are doing exactly the same thing that they say conditioned reinforcers are. Animals find, in essence, a reinforcer, and if that's predictive of more being there, they go there more. There's no strengthening at all, really, right? They call it an SD, but I don't think that works because the way we think about SDs requires a reinforcer somewhere in there. That's why I don't like that one. But it's still, it's a very much a signpost type account, except even the goals are signposts, right? Okay, now, and that gets you to here. So Galistell and Gibbon, 2000 or 2002, either one, 2002 is the book. They suggest that learning in general is learning that rather than to. So they dispense with the notion of strengthening at all. This is a timing-based approach. 5 minutes? Yeah, we're good. this is a timing-based approach, and that rather than having a reinforcer happen and strengthen something that happened before through back propagation of value, it's kind of like a magnetism kind of account as our traditional account of reinforcement, right? This reinforcer has something and then it transfers back to the things that are close to it. They suggest that you don't need that concept at all to account for learning that happens in operant and Pavlovian preparations. And then, in fact, what's happening is animals are learning that things are true. And as I've mentioned, Davison and Baum suggest basically the same thing, and without going into the differences, but that even primary reinforcers have signaling effects, and they call these things not reinforcers, but phylogenetically important events. And I don't think that Galistone and Gibbon would disagree with that, because that's what they are, phylogenetically important events. You can say that much for sure. Their idea is here that the strengthening is superfluous. And if you think about it hard, you can convince yourself that that could be true. And you don't have to accept that it's true, but it could be true. You don't need strengthening at all. It doesn't actually capture what's being learned. It's not strengthening of responses learning to do something, but learning that. Organisms learn the structure of events arranged in their environment. They learn where, and especially from this timing account, when and that things happen. They compare them, when they occur, what happens during them, the rates, and then they make decisions. There's no strengthening that occurs in this account at all. Now, this is a study they present in their book, which is, there's a whole series of them from Ralph Miller's lab. This is the simplest one, I think. And so I'll talk about it for just a second. This is a Pavlovian fear conditioning preparation. Okay, so here's what we have. We have standard delay conditioning. We have a tone CS followed by foot shock. You'd expect this to produce fear and suppression, right? And compared to another group who gets trace conditioning, so we introduce a delay here between the offset of the CS and the foot shock. Which of these produces better conditioning? The top one, right. And so what we would say from a standard associative account or a strengthening account is that, this is more temporally contiguous, it's strengthened, it's passed more value here, negative value in this case, to the tone CS than here because of this delay. Now here's where things get interesting. First of all, this second phase, and they showed that to be true, and this second phase, they do backward second order conditioning, which sounds horrible, but let's just start with the backward part. Does backward conditioning happen? Not really, right? Because the value back propagation happens in one direction. It propagates back. It doesn't propagate forward, right? So this is our CS. Notice that it's happening first. Here's our CS2, which happens second. So it's backward conditioning, and conditioning shouldn't happen anyway. Interestingly, which of these groups do you think, after pairing these things backwards, second order conditioning, which of these two groups showed better conditioning? Well, you must know the answer, or I wouldn't be talking about it, right? This one. So the group that you can demonstrate showed less conditioning, less transfer of value, when you put them in a situation that shouldn't produce any conditioning in the first place because it's backward and it's second order, this is the group that shows a stronger condition response to this. Now, if you start taking strengthening and value and placing it with the US here and moving it to the CS, you've got to do some pretty fancy footwork to get this to work. Now, it's not impossible, but it takes some pretty fancy footwork to do this. And their argument is that the way to interpret this is that the organism has, in essence, learned the temporal structure of the environment here, right? They've learned that when this goes off, in about 5 seconds, you're going to get shock, right? So if they learn that structure, then when this goes off, what you're expecting is shock, right? And so that's the important part that's happening here, is that they've learned this temporal structure. They've learned that these things are true about the environment. Ralph Miller uses a temporal coding hypothesis to account for these sorts of data. And he presents a workable associative account, but I have a hard time following it, honestly, because it gets pretty complicated. Lots of epicycles to account for it. Now, does that mean it's impossible? Absolutely not. But there are a lot of data out there in the realm of classical conditioning that we, as people who study condition reinforcement, have totally ignored. Basically, here's another fun one. Let's talk about this. Galisteo and Gibbon, notice the interesting name that we give this phenomenon, sensory preconditioning. It's not actually conditioning because it shouldn't happen, and it's sensory because it's somehow less than actual conditioning as well. But if you just take you can do this exact experiment. In fact, they did it in this paper. You do this part first, which is sensory preconditioning. There's no US, right? From a strengthening account, why the hell does that happen? It's just two neutral stimuli. We just totally ignore sensory preconditioning, give it a funny name because it doesn't seem to fit, and forget about it. Well, you do this experiment backwards, and you get exactly the same result. Do this phase, and then you do this phase, and then you test with this, and you get the same result. So sensory preconditioning is a tough one. What are the implications for choice theories? Let's bring it back to this. I don't think there are any. I'm sorry to say. In essence, here's the thing that we've always said. This DRT is really interesting theory because it makes connections to scalar expectancy theory. So they're both Pavlovian processes and independently developed accounts of condition reinforcement on the one account and classical conditioning on the other account. Actually, they're a little different in the way they do it. But the fact that the temporal context is important, we note that and say, yeah, it's a Pavlovian process, all is well with the world. Anyway, all of these really just differ in how are you supposed to calculate what's important to the animal with the terminal links here, right? Basically, if you look at Galisteo and Gibbon, basically that's all they do too, is try to figure out how you calculate the relevant things that are being compared here, and that's really all that these are doing. There's nothing in here, although this one has value in the name, which makes it a little complicated, but that's beside the point. I think they all work just fine. It's just a way of talking about them. They all describe systematic changes in behavior with structure. Strengthening is not inherent in those equations, and they just propose different ways that they're weighing their decisions. I think we have a lot more to learn about condition reinforcement from Pavlovian conditioning, picking up at SET and moving forward to understand what's going on now. And I don't know that people are doing that. So I'd like to encourage, if you're interested in condition reinforcement, there's a ton to learn in the Pavlovian literature that we haven't looked at with condition reinforcement as of yet. And that's all I have. Thank you.